Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you all in the name of CASIS at the University of Bonn at this special event to take a closer look at the Weimar Triangle at 30, Franco-German-Polish cooperation in foreign and security affairs. The wider context seems to be clear. I'm sure most of you already have heard of Europe's new catchphrase, strategic autonomy. Dealing with this key term in many security-related policy areas is part of our daily work inside CASIS, with our mission to focus on traditional and non-traditional challenges for security and strategy. In view of Europe's changing strategic position on the global stage, CASIS examines, among other things, how the EU can achieve closer integration of security policy while increasing the efficiency of security policy on the European continent. I'm convinced that we can move in the direction of these general aims of our CASIS mission statement only by forging out the internal details of different institutional formats. And one of those details concerns the question which members in these multilateral frameworks are ready and able to take their share of responsibility for common aims in terms of leadership. In CASIS, for example, we have a focus on the role of the odd Franco-German couple in European affairs and for global challenges. And as we all know, this couple, often called the bilateral engine for integration, since 7 decades had and still has its special role in Europe. But if it comes to trilateral instead of bilateral relationships, it is getting much more complicated, not only in mathematic dimensions, but in political relations as well. I don't want to bother you with math and rules of calculation, but in the real world of foreign and security policy questions, of role aspirations of just a few members of a large group are the most complicated, but I guess as well, fascinating aspects of our research. We have to keep in mind that so-called mini-lateral initiatives inside multilateral institutions often are the only chance for progress, but are a severe danger for the persistence of the institution at the same time. Against this background, I deeply appreciate the initiative of Dr. Julian Romanishin to shed light on chances and shortcomings of the so-called Weimar Triangle with experts from Poland, France, and Germany. Julian Romanishin is a Charlemagne Prize Fellow here at CASIS and Associate Fellow at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels. He's currently working on a project about EU strategic autonomy in security and defense, supported by the Charlemagne Prize Academy. He previously held teaching and research positions at New York University, Maastricht University, the Free University of Brussels, and the European University Institute. I'm grateful for this initiative and to our panelists in this special event who will be sharing their expertise on national politics involved and the perspectives on trilateral initiatives in European foreign and security policy. Thank you very much for taking your time for this digital event today. Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wolfram, for your kind introductory words. I'm really delighted to moderate this discussion today with such a great guest of experts. But before we start, I'd like to say just a few words about the topic we are dealing with. 30 years ago, the rationale for the Weimar Triangle was unmistakably clear. To build a new post-Cold War Europe, we could finally leave the dividing lines between the East and the West behind. But if we ask the same question today, more than 15 years after the EU's eastern enlargement, what is the purpose of the Weimar Triangle? The answer will be much less clear. Since the Brexit referendum in 2016, however, there have been growing calls to revive and intensify cooperation among the three European partners, in light of the need to reinforce leadership, cohesion, and unity within the EU. After all, today France, Germany, and Poland account for 45% of EU GDP, 42% of EU population, and more than half of EU defense spending. And moreover, rising security threats at the EU borders, combined with the return of great power competition, also add to the rationale of working together within the triangle to strengthen Europe's responses to these challenges. In their last joint statement, released in October last year, French, German, and Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs declared that, quote, the Weimar Triangle plays an important role not only in coordinating our positions, but also in initiating efforts towards a Europe of even greater solidarity within and united strengths on the international stage, end quote. Strong and ambitious rhetoric, but to what extent and how can it be transformed into reality? Does the Weimar Triangle have a potential to become a driving force to EU security and defense policy? And how can France, Germany, and Poland sort out their differences, which are numerous, and find a common ground on issues of strategic importance? So to discuss these questions, we are joined today by three excellent experts in the field of Franco-German-Polish relations. First, we are happy to welcome Dr. Tobias Kopf, who is a program officer at the Stiftung Genshagen, where he has been working since 2015. Previously, he worked as a researcher at Stiftung Wissenschaftenpolitik in Berlin and has been a transatlantic postdoctoral fellow for international relations and security at IFRI in Paris and at the US Institute for Peace in Washington, D.C. He defended his doctoral dissertation on French military interventions in sub-Saharan Africa at the University of Koblenz, and for 1 year he was also an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, working on Franco-German cooperation. Tobias, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Maxime Lefebvre, who is a career diplomat and professor of international and European affairs at the ESCP Business School in Paris. He began his career at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the 1990s, and since then has held positions in the French Embassy in Berlin and in the permanent representation to the EU. He also was deputy director of the policy planning staff in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, ambassador for cross-border cooperation, and ambassador to the OSCE in Vienna. Maxime has also worked in the French think tank IFRI and has written several books and articles about European policy and international relations. Maxime, many thanks for joining us today. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Monika Sus, who is an associate professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences and a fellow at the Center for International Security at the Hertie School in Berlin, where she currently leads the new Horizon 2020 project Engage, about envisioning a new governance architecture for a global Europe. Between 2015 and 2019, she was a Dahrendorf postdoctoral fellow at the Hertie School, where she directed the Dahrendorf Foresight Project. Monika was also a John Monnet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Florence, and held several visiting positions at the University of Leipzig, University of Montreal, and the European Union Center of Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh. Monika, it's a pleasure having you with us. Before I hand over to our distinguished panelists, a brief word of housekeeping rules. We intend to finish our discussion at 6:30 p.m. The webinar will be recorded and the video will later be available on the CASIS YouTube channel. And for all our listeners, I want to mention that in the second half of the conversation, we'll have time to address your questions. So please feel free to put forward your questions to our experts, which you can do by using the Q&A function at the bottom of the page. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our speakers, starting from Tobias Kopf. Tobias, the Weimar Triangle enjoys a special and consistent focus at Stiftung Genshagen, where you work, and you have been actively self-engaged with the topic for quite some time. What is your perspective on the role of the triangle when it comes to European foreign and security affairs?
Well, thank you, Julian, for introducing me. Thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure to talk to you here today. Yeah, that's a difficult question, and hard to answer very shortly. I mean, I think you asked me to speak a little bit about what the opportunities are today of the Weimar Triangle in the field of foreign and security affairs, and what the obstacles are. And let me maybe dive into that a little bit in the first place. Personally, I think the field of foreign and security affairs has been a very dynamic field in the realm of the Weimar Triangle over the last 10 years. I mean, it's sometimes, when you talk about we see all the problems that we have in the Weimar Triangle from time to time, then it always comes down to this, that okay, if we can talk about this topic, we can talk about that topic, but we can still talk about security and defense affairs, because there are maybe some less of hot potatoes than there are in other fields, like rule of law and energy policy, etc. So I think that the field of foreign and security policy is definitely a good field for cooperation for the Weimar Triangle, and it has been so, especially in security and defense policy. Especially between 2010 and 2015, there have been quite some initiatives also coming out of the Weimar Triangle to bring forward European security and defense policy, and they've been quite fruitful at the time. So there has been something going on, and so this is definitely that has a lot of potential. And as you already said in your introduction, I think the potential of it has become even bigger with the UK leaving the European Union for European foreign policy, because obviously the sheer weight of these three actors has become even bigger in Europe. And so I think there's a big chance today for this triangle. However, and this is the big however, there are so many obstacles also at this moment, which have toned down this dynamism a lot, especially over the last 5 years. I mean, there are some structural obstacles existing, obviously, between the three countries, because they have very different, very different foreign policies. I mean, I don't have to tell you that France is obviously an actor that has at least a global ambition. You can discuss about how big the ambition still is and how big French grandeur still is on the global playing field. But it has another ambition, obviously, than Poland, which is an actor that has more of a regional focus. This, I think, in Germany is lying somewhere in between the two, and I think this has always made it difficult to find common ground in Europe in foreign policy and security policy in particular, because just these ambitions are so different. This comes together, obviously, with geographical priorities, different geographical priorities. I think I don't have to go into detail. We'll speak about that later on, with Poland mostly focusing on the east of Europe, and France rather focusing on the southern part, and also with threat perceptions, obviously, because there are just different priorities with regard to threat perceptions. But I mean, I think these structural points, they can be overcome. But I think the main topic today, and this is, I think, something that is at the key of everything at the Weimar Triangle, is that at the moment, there's just a lack of trust between these three partners. And there's mainly a rift between Germany and France on the one side, and the current Polish government on the other side. And I think this lack of trust has also arrived in the field of foreign policy action. And this is very sad, because, as I said, between 2010 and 2015, there has been some dynamism, definitely. But since the current Polish government came to power in 2015, this dynamism has become a lot less. And I think this lack of trust, this is the main problem at the moment, also in the field of foreign policy action. So I think there's a lot to do for the Weimar Triangle, but there are also big obstacles.
Thank you, Tobias. I'm really glad that you mentioned so many potential factors that influence the relationship between the three countries, and obviously lack of trust is one of the major factors. But I'm really glad that you also mentioned the fact that indeed it's easy to forget that actually in 2010 the France, Germany, and Poland were behind with the driving force pushing for example, permanent structural cooperation, and there were letters sent to High Representative Ashton to raise the salience of security and defense policy. And indeed, today it seems like it was an eternity ago, and one might easily forget the fact. I would like now to turn now to Maxime Lefebvre. Maxime, what are your thoughts on this subject? Do you think the triangle has a potential to become a driving force for EU security and defense cooperation?
So thank you very much for for this debate and for having proposed that I can intervene as a French expert or an actor, as a diplomat. I would start with obstacles. I would say the same things that as Tobias has said. We have, of course, the political domestic situation, which is not very good at the time being, because we have a government in Warsaw which is not so pro-European, whereas in Germany is traditionally very pro-European, and France with President Macron is in a time where France is really investing a lot on Europe, and trying to push the European agenda, strategic autonomy, European sovereignty. So we have a basic problem of political coincidence between the three capitals at the time being because of the domestic context. Moreover, we have a difficulty with a different situation or interest towards NATO. France traditionally is more independent from NATO because of the nuclear deterrence, because of different orientations, geopolitical orientations. It's clear that for a country like Poland, the eastern flank, the relationship to Russia are totally key in the threat perception and in the foreign policy priorities, defense priorities. Whereas for France, we are focusing towards the Mediterranean Sea, towards Africa, the intervention in Sahel. So it's clear that in this sense, maybe Germany is more oriented towards the priorities of Poland, whereas from the point of view of Paris, there is not such a priority to cooperate with Germany and Poland, because it's not top priority for the French foreign policy. The difficulty also is that, diplomatically speaking, when you are talking, there is of course a very strong Franco-German link. This is a central relationship in the history of European integration. It's not so clear what kind of role the Weimar Triangle can play. Of course, it was designed at the beginning in 1991 as a forum to foster reconciliation, to extend the reconciliation between France and Germany to the relationship between Germany and Poland. So this can have a useful interest in terms of cooperation between civil societies. There is the cooperation with Genshagen. Genshagen is a key place to foster this cooperation between the three countries. Of course, when you are an ambassador in Poland, you have an interest to work about this Weimar cooperation. But basically, if you look at the geopolitical balance in Europe, I don't see why the Weimar Triangle should play a bigger role, for example, than the cooperation between France, Germany, and Italy, or between France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland, for example. We had regular meetings in the diplomatic formats between the big six before the Brexit. So the six big countries, including Poland. Now it's not existing anymore, these big six, because Britain has left. But there is already a format between the big countries, Italy, Spain, Poland, France, Germany, which exists. So what is the space, the diplomatic space left specifically to the Weimar Triangle. Look at the role of the Weimar Triangle in the Ukraine crisis. At the beginning, at the beginning of 2014, there was an attempt from the three capitals, the three foreign ministers, to stop the crisis in Ukraine, but it failed because after the agreement which was brokered, Yanukovych had to leave power. And what happened? There was a crisis with Russia, Crimea, the eastern Ukraine, and only France and Germany played the leading role in creating the Normandy format and in discussing with Ukraine and Russia. So in all these perspectives, I would say the diplomatic potential is not so high for this Weimar Triangle. However, there are some opportunities, and I would like to mention some of them. Of course, when you talk about NATO, about collective defense, about military threats, about deterrence towards Russia, it's clear that we are more in a NATO framework, not specifically in a EU framework. However, there is room, for example, for working on non-military threats. If you see the contribution to the European defense policy to non-military threats, it can be useful to work together, France, Germany, and Poland, about these non-military threats, where the role of the EU is more important than the role of NATO. If you see the industrial and defense policy, I would say there is also a potential to work better on common projects in the framework of PESCO, in the framework of the European Defence Fund. I think there could be some common projects launched between the three countries. But of course, there is a necessity that the Polish government not only relies on the United States for its defense, for its armament policy and acquisitions, but also tries to Europeanize its defense policy, to Europeanize its imports in military goods. I would say also that there could be an interest, a potential of cooperation between the three countries in the framework of the Conference on the Future of Europe, because it's a forum where you can do a lot of different contributions, and we could imagine that there could be some contribution of the three countries together in order to push forward some specific projects or topics. So let's use this forum of the Conference on the Future of Europe. I would say also that from the French perspective, in particular, when there is going to be the French presidency of the European Union next year, there is a strong interest to work with Eastern and Central European countries. So there is the objective of having a Weimar summit. There is a perspective of having a meeting of the three foreign ministers at the end of the summer. So this could be also opportunities to work on concrete proposals. And I would like to say also that in order to overcome our differences, our different priorities, there could be, for example, joint work. I'm not speaking officially when I say that. I'm invited as an expert, not as an official diplomat. But why should we not talk together about what definition we could give to strategic autonomy, including in the field of defense? Because France is not telling that European strategic autonomy should lead to reduce the role of NATO. So I would say we could work on that between the three capitals. And I would also suggest that we don't use only the governments, but also the parliaments and the civil society. The parliaments could work together, including in a Weimar format, for example, to work on these topics. And maybe the parliaments would be less mistrustful towards the EU than the Polish government. And of course, the civil society gives room for discussions, debates, which are also in another framework than with the present Polish government. So, all in all, I would say there are some opportunities through the obstacles and differences. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime, for covering such a wide spectrum of issues. I personally have a lot of follow-up questions, but I would like first to give the floor to Monica and to ask what are her views on the prospects for Franco-German-Polish cooperation in this field. Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you for having me. And I have to say I'm in the comfortable position of talking after two excellent speakers, so I can very much repeat some of the points that they already mentioned. And actually, I would like to also start with some obstacles and maybe try to put it in a bit from a bit different perspective. But from my perspective, I rather see, and here again, I will be somehow coherent with the previous speakers, three biggest obstacles for the cooperation of Weimar Triangle in the field of security and defense. The first one being already mentioned, dispute over the rule of law and the judicial reform in Poland. Of course, here the leading criticism comes from the European Commission, but I mean, of course, and obviously Germany and France are also strongly opposing the reforms that are going on in Poland for quite some time. And this is, as I think Tobias and also Maxim mentioned, the lack of trust that we are actually facing very strongly and very presently in different relations, but also, and mainly I would say, it also concerns the field of security and defense, because I mean, you cannot really cooperate in the field of security and defense if you don't trust each other, right? So this is the biggest obstacle that I see. But then there are two other obstacles, and I think these obstacles are more general, and they have been with us for quite some time. So not only since 2015, since we have the new government in Poland, well, not so new, but still let's say the big change came in 2015. But the two other obstacles, the more general ones, are, from my perspective, on one hand, the divergent visions for European integration. And here, just to give you an example, France and Germany, as the members of the Eurozone, one of the founding members of the Eurozone, actually see the Eurozone as the core of the European integration and as the core of the European Union, rightly so, probably. On the other hand, however, Poland, as a non-member state of the Eurozone, and actually a country without any specific plans to join the Eurozone, opposes this view and opposes this policy. And this has several consequences, for example, budgetary consequences, but also it is simply not possible for Poland to be at the table at every important discussion because it is not a member of the Eurozone. And now with the European Defence Fund and with the European Defence, with the European Commission's money being invested for, let's say, projects connected with European defense integration, the budgetary issues will have actually a stronger meaning, and they will be more meaningful in the future. So I think this is one of these more general obstacles. And the other obstacle, also mentioned, I think, by Maxime, are the divergent views on the NATO question, with France questioning the effectiveness of NATO. We all remember the famous speech of Emmanuel Macron about the brain death of NATO. And of course, it also somehow relates to the question how France and Germany see United States. There are obviously very different perspectives on the United States coming from these two countries and from Poland, of course. There is a question of strategic autonomy that has been also mentioned. And just to give you another example, maybe a bit more specific one and a very hands-on example, because we have been discussing this in Brussels for quite some time. And there is a question of qualified majority voting, of the introduction of qualified majority voting in the area of security and defense, at least in some of the fields of this big policy area. And of course, again, Poland is against it, since it fears that it will somehow lose the possibility of veto some policies that Poland maybe is not in favor of. And on the other hand, France and Germany are strongly in favor for qualified majority voting, because it would increase the effectiveness of foreign and security policy. So this is just to mention a couple of obstacles. But in fact, I also deeply share, I think, the opinion of both previous speakers that there is a potential for the Weimar Triangle. And actually, I would say that these differences and these obstacles that we all have been mentioning for the last 30 minutes, to some extent make the Weimar Triangle even more important. Because, I mean, just to give you another example, to formulate a coherent approach to Russia coming from the EU, or to use the potential of the PESCO projects, the three countries need to cooperate and need to find a common ground. And minilateral formats, as Professor Hilz also mentioned, such as the Weimar Triangle, actually give an opportunity, of course, for prior consultations, for maybe, let's say, unofficial talks and unofficial consultations before European summits. And this is all very, very needed, especially in terms, in light of these difficulties that we have just mentioned. And to end on a bit more positive note, with potential for cooperation, PESCO has been already mentioned a couple of times. And I think, to my knowledge, there are 3 projects in which all of 3 countries are actually engaged in. And they, again, are, as Maxime rightly noticed, more or less all in the area of non-military security. To some extent, there is European Secure Software-Defined Radio, Integrated Unarmed Ground System, and the most important project from my perspective, if it comes to the cooperation potential, is the military mobility. So this is one of the biggest PESCO projects, as we all know, and I think this project and this issue, actually, this is not only a project, this is a big issue also for NATO and for the EU, has the potential to somehow combine, let's say, the more NATO-oriented approach coming from Poland with the more EU-oriented approach coming from France, and the somewhat in the middle approach coming from Germany. And Germany, especially in the when we talk about military mobility, is of course a key country, because it is a logistics hub for moving troops, potential troops from the west, from western part of Europe to the eastern part of Europe. So I think these 3 countries can actually cooperate very well on this project. And again, military mobility is a big question for both EU and NATO. So again, here we would have a cooperation potential also for these 2 organizations. And maybe one final sentence. I very much like the statement that Maxime made at some point about whether we really need Weimar Triangle. So what is the diplomatic potential for this format, let's say? And to stay also on this provocative note, maybe to some extent, I would also actually suggest that maybe we shall start discussing more flexible geometry within the Weimar Triangle, for example, by including other countries like Italy or Spain, or possibly also non-European countries like Ukraine, of course, issue-oriented and issue-related, on issue-related areas and issue-related needs. I think it could be actually also maybe a way to go farther with the triangle, since from the Polish perspective, and if I look at Polish press and Polish policy briefs, one can somehow get the impression that Weimar Triangle actually somehow fulfilled its task, and the task was to kind of help Poland to join the European Union, European communities. And actually, it can be easily argued that since 2004, there is no real vision what the triangle actually can do and should do. And there are, of course, policy areas such as competition policy, for example, of many areas, or of free trade policy and protecting free trade, and other areas coming from the field of economics, where the 3 countries cooperate very well with each other. But again, on the field of security and defense, there is this big question mark, at least for me, whether really this triangle can bring something new. And yeah, I just put it forward to the discussion to open it a bit and to introduce a more flexible forms of cooperation if needed. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Monica, for so many interesting ideas. I'm really glad there were some parallels in your comments and Maxime's comments, especially related to the flexible geometry. And indeed, it actually, if you remember, in 2012 there was a letter issued by Weimar Plus group addressed to, if I'm not mistaken, again to the High Representative, with the view to boost CSDP with regard to establishing military headquarters, etc. So this G5 format, it seems it has been practiced in the past, but I think there was a new statement last year by four defense ministers, and it was only again G4. Poland was not there. That was in relation to COVID situation, etc. So it was a big question mark why Poland is not interested in being member of this bigger club. Let me ask you a question that's on everyone's mind, and that's the question related to European strategic autonomy. And Maxime already mentioned that this might be an area of possible future cooperation between the three states. And if we recall the Trump administration, the Trump presidency, at that time it seemed like Germany, France, and Poland had developed quite different attitudes towards the issue of European autonomy, right? So President Macron actually promoted the notion. He said this is the right moment, this is momentum, while questioning the effectiveness of NATO. All went in completely different direction of fully embracing what we say strategic embrace of Trump and U.S. military assistance, and being very suspicious about the idea of autonomy. And Germany was caught in the middle. So now, 6 months into the new Biden administration, what do you think? What is your sense of what is your feeling about those differences between Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw on the issue of strategic autonomy? Have they been narrowed in this time, in the last 6 months, or they are as wide open as they were before? Perhaps, Maxime, would you like to start?
Yes, I can jump in, of course. I think since the coming of the Biden administration, I would say that things are getting easier for a cooperation like the Weimar cooperation, because of course we are all, the transatlantic relationship is getting more stable. There are less differences, or at least clear differences between the states. For France, it was very clear that, and it's the official speech in Paris, that we should work in the framework of this renewal of the transatlantic relationship. And Paris is very clear in presenting the ambitions for European sovereignty, for strategic autonomy, as a complement to the transatlantic relationship. So, in this sense, Trump has brought much trouble in the transatlantic relationship, but now it's getting more stable, more previsible, I would say previsible. So I would say things are easier. Of course, it's clear that the speech about strategic autonomy was fostered by the problems with the Trump administration, where it was clear that we need a stronger Europe, we need a more autonomous Europe, we need the Europe which is more geopolitical, which is able to defend its interests, including, for example, in the problem of extraterritorial sanctions. So this was, of course, fostered during the years of Donald Trump. Maybe with Biden, it will be less difficult. But Biden, for example, look at the dossier of Nord Stream, how the Biden administration is trying to find a compromise with Germany about European energy security. So I think the Biden administration will contribute to reduce the tensions. And what Emmanuel Macron, it was mentioned that Emmanuel Macron was speaking about brain death of NATO. This was in a context where we had a lot of issues with Turkey, and I think this was easier with the Trump administration, which was a bit isolationist, which wanted to put the European integration into question. I think with this Biden administration, it will be easier to find common grounds. And I think in these common grounds, we need to maybe better define what Europe's strategic autonomy is. Europe's strategic autonomy is not against the transatlantic relationship, is not against the United States, but it is trying to better define and defend Europe's interests and values in complement with the United States. So in this sense, I would say a format like the Weimar Triangle, because there are different views, different perceptions, could be a contribution to a better understanding of the European ambitions and a better consolidation of the transatlantic relationship. But of course, if you look, for example, at the proposal of Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel of renewing the summits with Putin, you know, these proposals has met some differences, different views in the last European Council. So we still have some divergences. It's a bit strange that the EU is not talking to the Russians, at least at the top level, or with Lavrov. Morel has tried to make a trip to Moscow, which was not a success, but it's a bit stupid that the Americans are ready to talk to the Russians and the Europeans are not able to do the same. So we need to work on these issues, I think. And I agree that the Weimar Triangle could be a good diplomatic format to work out these differences and try to find, to make some progress.
Thanks, Maxime. Tobias or Monica, would like to weigh in on the issue of strategic autonomy and narrowing or widening the gap between the three members of the triangle.
Sure, why not? So I agree with Maxime again that it has been easier over the last 6 months. And I think we also witnessed a big change when Joe Biden was in Brussels by the end of June, right? When he actually, for the very first time, expressed a very clear support for PESCO or for deepening of the European integration within security and defense. And he also said that the United States is really ready to cooperate within the PESCO framework, and Europe is also open to that. So that was, of course, new and a big difference from the Trump era. But on the other hand, I would say that, or rather, I would again put it into discussion. I have my doubts whether we really should discuss the meaning of the notion of strategic autonomy, because I mean. From my point of view, the notion is not really new. I think strategic autonomy has been mentioned for the first time by the European Commission in 2002, 2003 in some documents. So the notion has been somehow floating around in Brussels. But of course, I mean, Emmanuel Macron was the one who brought it really into the debate and put it on the agenda. And since then, and there has been a lot of studies coming from think tanks, the notion has become a really, really contagious one, right, among member states of the EU. Because we all member states understand the notion differently, and there has been a lot of discussion how to understand this notion. And I think it was one of the discussions linked to strategic compass, which is also an important exercise. I think that could be somehow maybe a new opening for the Weimar Triangle to some extent. Actually, not to specifically mention the notion of strategic autonomy, but to rather try to talk about geopolitical Europe and how Europe sees itself in the area of geopolitical competition between China and the US and different other challenges. and instead of focusing on discussing a notion of strategic autonomy itself. So I'm not sure how to really deal with that. On one hand, I think it will be, as Maxim said, a needed discussion among these three countries, among the foreign ministries of these three countries, France, Poland, and Germany, how we really understand this notion. But on the other hand, I think it's also good to focus on the content of the policy and not to debate endlessly what do we understand under this notion to some extent. From Polish perspective, and I will end with that, actually nothing has changed, meaning that Poland is, I would say, it is not Polish government, the current Polish government is not against strategic autonomy, but only and really only if the strategic autonomy somehow contributes to NATO. So it is not about the strategic autonomy of the EU, but rather the strategic autonomy of somehow Europe with the strong European pillar of NATO or at NATO. And then Poland, I think, will be willing to contribute and willing to sign off for projects like, for example, military mobility or other PESCO projects, for example, and that, of course, somehow contributes to strengthening of the European autonomy. But again, they are also in line with NATO policy, and they contribute to strengthening of NATO, of European pillar of NATO, simply because of one reason, and the reason is money. So there is a limited number, of course, of money that can be spent for defense in every country. And the Polish government fears that if countries will focus on strengthening EU strategic autonomy, then simply it will be not enough money willing to be spent to defend the eastern flank. And I think we will talk about threat perceptions maybe later in the discussion, but this is also a biggest difference between France, Poland, and Germany. This is the threat perception. And therefore for Poland, eastern flank and NATO are absolutely crucial if it comes to security, and all linked with European strategic autonomy. EU strategic autonomy is somehow secondary from this perspective.
Thank you, Monica, for clarifying the Polish views on the notion, and also introducing the strategic compass process into the discussion. Tobias, we'd like to reflect on this question of strategic autonomy and perhaps also the German position in this debate.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if I'm the best place to explain the German position. I think in general, what always strikes me about this debate, but that has already been mentioned by Monica, is that this term strategic autonomy is so somehow difficult to grasp and so difficult to understand, and everybody defines it as they wish to define it, which obviously makes it difficult to find compromises. I've read today, I've read a study which was issued by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the Fondation Jean Jaurès in France, and I think it was about European sovereignty, and they put to a number of people all these terms and asked people in a random survey whether they understand what they mean. And strategic autonomy has the term that has been least understood by the people. So this shows that I think not only in political circles, but also amongst the bigger public, which is obviously important to take on board when you have this kind of debate, they have trouble with understanding what these terms actually mean. So it needs to be filled with life also, and somehow explained what it actually means. I think that's the main problem with this debate around strategic autonomy.
Thank you, Tobias. I'd like to touch upon the issue of Russia, because it was mentioned already by both Maxime and Monica. And obviously, Russia is one of those areas where where positions of three members of Triangle seem to be wide apart, right? So one can say that Moscow can be seen as simultaneously as potential partner, business opportunity, or existential threat, depending whether you sit in Paris, Berlin, Warsaw. And do you think that the Triangle stands a chance to reach consensus on Russia policy, and how this consensus would look like? I think Monica mentioned that this might be the area where three governments can work or should work. How should this consensus look like on the Russia policy? And in the meantime, I would like also to remind our listeners that they can type their questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them very shortly.
You want me to start, Julian, or?
You can go ahead, Maxim, yes.
Yes. I would say that fundamentally Russia and the Eastern Partnership on the situation in the East, the Eastern flank, are of course basic common interests or common topics of discussion for the Weimar Triangle. There is no doubt about that. It's not only about Russia, it's also about Belarus, for example, what is happening there. It's very important that we talk together about the situation in Belarus. It has of course, security implications, but not only for the EU foreign policy, but also for the situation in the East, for the stability of the continent. So I think it's very important to discuss these issues in the framework of the Weimar Triangle. There is no issue on that. Are we able to reach a common ground? For myself, I think there is a common ground. There are five principles which has been defined in 2016. And for the moment, these principles are there. It's not only a consensus among the countries of the Weimar Triangle, but among all EU members. There can be nuances about what should be done, proposed. For example, when France and Germany made this proposal of a new summit with Russia, this is seen by some member states as a kind of reward to Russia. But talking to a country where we have not a common view, where we have some differences, should not be seen as a reward. It's a necessary discussion to defend our interests, to defend our values. And I don't see the issue of a summit with Russia as something which is a kind of concession to the Russians. But this should be discussed, of course, in the Weimar Triangle, but it's more about tactics than about basic positions. When President Macron proposed, I think it was at the end of 2019, to make a kind of reset with the Russians, to discuss with the Russians to many issues. Pierre Vimont was nominated to be the special envoy of the president to do that. And one of the main roles of Pierre Vimont is to travel across Europe to explain what the French intentions were and to try to find common grounds. So I would say the discussion inside the Weimar Triangle could be a kind of contribution to a European consensus. But at the time being, I see the European consensus there, and I don't think it's going to change. For example, the next election in Germany, federal elections, I'm not sure that there will be a big change in the Russia policy of Germany. And I don't also not see, maybe if Marine Le Pen is elected, things will be different in France, but this is not the more likely scenario. And I think, once again, we have a basic Russia policy, but we need to think about the future. We need to think about the best tactics. We need to think about what could be changed, how we could make our Russia policy more effective in order to get results. And this can be discussed in the Weimar Triangle. But once again, there is, at the time being, an EU consensus on that.
Thank you very much, Maxime. Monica Tobias, would you like to reflect on the question of the Russia policy? Also, in the context of recent discussions in the European Council, indeed, there was strong backlash against the proposal of Angela Merkel and Macron for the summit with Vladimir Putin, and that followed just after Biden met Putin. It seemed that even though we have 5 principles that were agreed in 2016, there is now also the new paper that was issued delivered by Borrell on 16th of June with regard to options for Russia policy. There seems to be still some lack of strategic consensus on the way forward. But I would be happy to listen to your perspective on this question.
Well, maybe just quickly. I mean, Maxime already has mentioned so many things, but I mean, he did not mention, if I got it right, one of the elephants in the room, which is the Nord Stream 2 dispute, where there has been a rift this time between France and Poland on one side and Germany on the other side. I think this is definitely something that has to be addressed in this issue. I mean, the German position is quite contested, also within Germany, by the way. And so I think this is definitely something that an elephant in the room that needs to be sorted out if the Weimar Triangle wants to discuss productively about Russia policy. I think that's something very important.
I can only agree with Tobias. This is indeed an issue that always comes up in every interview I've made with every Polish foreign security expert or official from Defense Ministry, Foreign Affairs Ministry. And it was really not important from which party the expert was or the experts were. The question of Nord Stream has been raised immediately, and it has been raised as the biggest obstacle indeed for the common EU approach towards Russia. Also, it is one of the biggest problems in the Polish-German relationship, but that's quite obvious, I guess. So I think that there is potential to cooperate within the triangle on Russia, but I'm rather skeptical whether it will really be a successful thing for the next couple of years. Also because, again, of the very divergent threat perceptions. And I'm not sure if any one of you has read a very interesting paper, actually, on the question of strategic autonomy and US and European sovereignty to some extent, that has been published recently in International Security by Hugo Myers and I think Stephen Brooks, his co-author. And they both engage in a very comprehensive analysis of threat perceptions of the European countries, of the EU countries, actually. And from their study, it has become clear that the 3 countries, Poland, Germany, and France, actually differ so much if it comes to how they see Russia that it is really difficult to talk about any consensus there or any room for cooperation. I'm exaggerating a bit just to make you curious to read this piece, but I think there is really a big difference between France and Poland and Germany also when it comes to how these countries see Russia. And from my point of view, being from Poland and observing Polish politics, it will not change in the next, I'd say, foreseeable future.
Thanks, Monica. Speaking about change, I was wondering, to what extent the recent decision of the Biden administration to greenlight the pipeline, to what extent this decision actually can change their position of the Polish government? There has been very strong reaction up to saying that it's betrayal, another betrayal, etc. And in that context, I wanted to frame this question perhaps in bigger context. How we know that the Polish government kind of doubled down on the US as a strategic partner, a security provider, on bilateral help during the Trump administration. And I'm wondering to what extent this almost exclusive orientation on the US is sustainable when it comes to Poland. Also, not only in the context of the Nord Stream 2 decision, but also in the context of the Biden administration's increasing emphasis on democratic standards and values. So it's a question to Monica, but of course, Maxime and Tobias, please feel free to weigh in on this question as well.
I can be very brief on that because I think it is clear that this policy is not sustainable at all. And Polish government is actually very lost on both the EU flank and the US flank currently, since Biden came to the office and changed its position towards Europe and towards Nord Stream and towards several issues. And I mean, many experts, including me, have been arguing for years that this policy to be focused only on US is a big mistake, of course, but yeah, it is the way it is. And I think Poland is really, I mean, the Polish government, again, is now kind of, to some extent, really helpless. And there are a lot of discussions going on in Warsaw right now to somehow try to cooperate better with Germany on economic issues, you know, in order to find at least one ally that will be strong enough to somehow be on the side of Poland when we now kind of lost the US in the narrative of Polish government. But it is a very difficult situation for the government. And we have a new opening since a couple of days, meaning that Donald Tusk decided to return to the Polish political scene. And this is now the big hope of the Polish opposition that something will change in the next 2-3 years. I won't go into details there because it's a completely another discussion, but the foreign policy of this government is, of course, well, I won't put it in normative terms, but I would say a difficult one.
If I may add a word about Nord Stream, I'm not sure it will be such a big problem in the future. And the French position was not against Nord Stream 2. The French position, France is contributing to the project through a French company, which is NG, and it is involved in the project, it supports the project, but the effort of France from a diplomatic point of view was more to be neutral and try to enhance the European energy security to ensure that the gas pipeline will not play against our own interests. And I think that this is a typical effect of the policy of the new administration of Joe Biden. Donald Trump was against the gas pipeline, so it was really criticizing Germany, etc. But the new administration has understood that this pipeline was now more or less achieved. It's ready to be implemented. There is not much to be done to stop this project. So I think the US administration has been very pragmatic in trying a solution which is not against Ukraine, which is not against Ukraine's energy policy. And I think this is a very good, very pragmatic diplomatic move in order to find a common solution. And typically it's an element where we are going to find a common ground in reality through the support of the US. Washington, who could have waited, for example, the election in Germany before doing that. Maybe with a green participant in the government in Germany, which is against the pipeline, but they have preferred to work out a diplomatic solution already now. So I think it's this Nord Stream 2 is not such an obstacle, I think, for the cooperation. And maybe it will, as Monica was saying, it will be a contribution for Poland to try to make a more European stance, to play more European. And I think it can be a contribution to a better understanding, including in our relationship to Russia, etc. You should not forget that France and Britain made a war against Russia in the 19th century in Crimea. So the question of the balance of power, of the use of force policy with the neighbors is a very important issue seen from France and from Britain. So after what happened in Ukraine, the Ukraine crisis, the European policy became really tougher with sanctions. And of course, France and Germany want to try to explore diplomatic solutions to find a peaceful settlement for this conflict. But France and Germany are really defending Ukraine, are really trying to prevent a new war at the east of the continent, and are really playing a hard policy towards Russia, a combination of dialogue but also of firmness. So I think I'm more optimistic than others about the possibility of trying a common ground on that.
You guys would like to weigh in on this question? All right.
No.
In the meantime, we have a first question from the audience, and it's actually addressed to Tobias. And the question is essentially about since there are certain policy fields like rule of law and human rights and other issues that are contested in the relationship between members of the triangle. To what extent we can actually compartmentalize and separate those issues that seem to be contested and politicized for the sake of more efficient and effective cooperation in the field of foreign and security politics. So the question is, the listener is wondering if we really can separate those policy fields and state no matter what reforms the Peace Party implements, can we still work together, but just on a different level?
I'm not sure if I fully get the question, but I try to respond to it anyway. I mean, I didn't say that. I mean, it suggests that. I mean, I didn't suggest that because these other fields don't work, we have to cooperate in the field of foreign and security policy. I mean, it's just I said that governments found it easier to cooperate in this field because maybe it didn't work out so well in other fields. That's just what I said. And I mean, so should we still cooperate in foreign policy with the peace government if they like worsen or even I don't know if they become more radical in a way after maybe re-election? That's probably what this question goes to. I mean, it's hypothetical. We don't know whether they will be re-elected and which direction they would want to go. And I mean, I'm always also pro cooperation, but I think we definitely should try to cooperate with the government, even if they have a very different view, because I think that's the only way we can work in international affairs if we cooperate with other governments as much as possible. Which does not mean that we should like totally neglect or be blind, have a blind eye on the rule of laws issue. That I think that's quite obvious in a way. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Thanks. I think your answer is quite clear. And again, I would encourage the listeners to post more questions in the Q&A box. In the meantime, since we were on the page of Ukraine, I think Maxim, you mentioned the fact that the mediation that Weimar Triangle offered in 2014 in Ukraine. That it was one of the examples of triangle in action, and although I think you mentioned in the context that it was a failed attempt, I think in some of the members of Triangle probably would portray this as a success, at least in the short term. But I'm wondering, so my question would be to what extent there is a potential to expand the Normandy format and to include Poland. So again, we will have revived Weimar Triangle in action and when it comes to Ukraine. And more broadly, if we look at the Eastern Partnership, to what extent the Eastern Partnership and I'm thinking here about Belarus, about conflict in the Horn-Karabakh, to what extent the Weimar Triangle has a potential here in this field? Is this the low-hanging fruit for cooperation among the two countries, and to what extent this mediation effort that was practiced, was applied in 2014, to what extent it can be expanded towards other cases in the eastern neighborhood.
I don't know so much if the Normandy format can be developed, or if there can be an extension. There is, for example, the suggestion of having the United States on board. I was always struck in this Ukraine crisis by the fact that in 2008, when there was the Georgian crisis, the EU was really a mediator in the crisis. It was President Sarkozy at that time. He was president of the EU. He traveled to Moscow, to Tbilisi, and he brokered an agreement in order to stop this conflict between Russia and Georgia. In the case of Ukraine, the EU is not playing anymore this role of mediation. The EU is only an actor to put sanctions. It has stopped talking to the Russians. There are no more summits. There are no more councils between Russia and the EU. When Borrell traveled to Moscow, it was not a success. I know the Russians are not helping, but there is a problem of the position of the EU, which is only an instrument to put sanctions on Russia. And so, who is going to make the mediation? If you want to see, for example, the energy policy or the relationship to Ukraine, the European Commission can play a role. It has brokered some agreements between Ukraine and Russia. The European Commission, the DG Energy. But in the diplomatic field, we have no mediation possible from the EU. And I think that's a problem. And that's why France and Germany had to play this role, had to start a mediation, Hollande at the time and Merkel. And this has worked. It's not a full success, of course, but we had this Minsk II agreements. The conflict, the escalation has stopped. So I'm not totally sure that a country like Poland, especially if Poland wants to make the policy harder, would be a good addition to the format in order to bring some agreements and to make a mediation. So I'm a bit skeptical about today in the present political, geopolitical context. I'm a bit skeptical about the possibility of having a useful Weimar format cooperation in these issues. But I must say something. When I was ambassador to the OSCE, there was an agreement to make a joint Weimar presidency of the OSCE. It was agreed, I think, in 2010. So France, Germany, Poland would assume the presidency of the OSCE after each other. But there were some obstacles from Berlin, there were some obstacles from Warsaw, there were some obstacles from Paris, and at the end, only Germany decided to take over the presidency of the OSCE. So this project of having a joint presidency of the OSCE through the Weimar countries didn't work. And today, I don't see exactly what the political and diplomatic role of the Weimar Triangle could be in the present context. Personally, I would be more, I think the Normandy format has proven efficient, and I'm not sure there are some changes which are needed now.
I think Ukrainian presence might might disagree slightly with this assessment, especially since the crisis in April when we witnessed the Russian massive troops on the Ukrainian border, and then very rather weak response of the Normandy format. And there was a statement, I think, on 1st of April, blaming both sides or asking both sides to de-escalate, which was quite negatively received in Ukraine. And if we go back to 2014, I think the very first format that was initiated was the Geneva format, so-called Geneva format, when not only when actually Ashton and John Kerry were present, and then somehow they were replaced by Germany and France. So that's when it became history. Anyways, Tobias and Monica, would you like to also comment on this? Otherwise, yeah, Monica.
Maybe just very briefly, two fingers on the transformation from the Weimar format in 2013-14 into the Normandy format. So from the Polish perspective, that was of course a disaster, and simply because one of the big figures that played a big role on the mediation was Radek Sikorski, that was in very good relations with Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the German foreign minister back then. And it was actually one of their initiatives to somehow go to Kiev and try to mediate. So for Poland, to kind of, get the information of being excluded from the format was, of course, a difficult question, also difficult to sell it politically internally in Poland, since Poland was very close with Germany and also with France back at the time. So it was a problem for the Polish government and for Donald Tusk specifically to some extent. But again, I have to agree with Maxime that nowadays we really cannot imagine Poland joining the format for many reasons, but simply also because to be a mediator in any of the countries of Eastern Partnership, you have to trust each other, and there is no trust, as we said at the very beginning of this event, between these three countries for several reasons. So I cannot, again, also agreeing with Maxime, imagine these three countries somehow joining efforts and mediating in one of the Eastern Partnership countries. And again, just one sentence on the necessity to talk to Russia. I completely agree that we have to somehow, the EU, have to somehow find a way to talk to Russia, because it is not a solution not to talk to a neighbor, right? But I think what the Polish government, and not only Polish government, but also many governments of different countries, like, for example, the Baltic states, but also other countries, feared before Borrell went to Moscow. It was precisely what happened. So that Borrell is not strong enough somehow, it is maybe not prepared enough, I'm not sure, to make the visit a success. And when thinking about the potential summit with Russia, then again, we have to really make sure that the EU is prepared for that and is prepared to talk to Russia in a language that Russia understands. And that is not an antagonizing language, of course, that should be a language of cooperation to some extent at least. But again, it cannot, I think this is the big fear coming from these countries that are skeptical for these forms of dialogue, that the situation from Moscow with Borrell will happen again, or will somehow repeat. And then the EU, of course, loses any time of credibility, any level of credibility, not only externally but also internally as a geopolitical actor. So I think this is one of the challenges that we are very much facing nowadays as the EU.
Thank you, Monica. In the meantime, we have another question from the audience. Jan Bernard asks, is there any sign the Polish government would be willing to push for a common military goods procurement through PESCO, even in less important areas? So the question is to what extent we can expect more active participation of foreign government in PESCO projects, and perhaps to add to that question, what do you think about the prospects of the Weimar Triangle working in the areas such as future combat air system and battleground tank project? that is currently spearheaded by France and Germany. I think, Maxime, you mentioned the fact that industrial cooperation might be one of those areas where where three members of the triangle can work together. So Polish participation in PESCO and FCAS and MGES.
So if I may just say two sentences, I think Poland is really, it has to be open to, joint procurement within the EU as well. It cannot be only focused on the industrial cooperation in terms of defense industry with the US, and this is something that the Polish government knows very well. On the other hand, Polish defense industry cannot be compared in terms of size and wealth with the German or the French one. So the fear that Poland has is to be somehow sidelined when we talk about common and joint procurement. So I think my short answer will be yes, there is a potential from the Polish government to engage in that. And I think the engagement in several PESCO projects actually kind of, proves it. But at the same time, there is a cautious policy, I would say, coming from Poland because of the differences in potential of military defense industry between Poland and the other big EU states. And as far as the common project between France and Germany is concerned, from my understanding or from what I've heard from the Polish government, let's say, voices, is that Poland wanted to be invited to join the project, but it hasn't been invited. So that's the short answer.
Thank you, Monica. Yes, Maxime?
Yes, I think it's really an area where we should definitely make some progress because we need a stronger Europe. We need a more competitive Europe. If you see, for example, Airbus is really a huge success for Europe. We were able to create a European champion, able to cope with Boeing. So it's a world leader now, equal to Boeing. And what we have done in the civilian field with Airbus, we should achieve it in the military field now with a common air combat system, European air combat system. This is definitely the direction that we are leading to in France and in other countries, in Germany, etc. And I think Poland has to be part of this project. Definitely, I'm not an expert I don't know exactly where we are now on this in this field, but there needs to be a common cooperation on that. It's very important that in the market, in the European market for military goods, we have to be less dependent on the United States, on US imports. Of course, NATO is very important. It's a base for our collective defense. We need a strong transatlantic link. We need a strong transatlantic security and defense cooperation. But we should also understand that there is a huge geopolitical context where the US is shifting more and more towards Asia, towards Russia, towards China. I apologize, not towards Russia. And that's why we need a stronger Europe. We need a more solidar Europe also in security issues. And I see the European armament cooperation as a very strong basis for that. And there should be a way of having the Eastern and Central European countries more associated to that. I give you an example. Croatia was the 5th country buying the French air fighter Rafale. So there is a potential for that, for this more European attitude in the European defense industry and armaments cooperation. So I hope that there will be progress on that, and this is definitely an area where we should discuss together in the Weimar Triangle.
I think this is also the point that Florence Parly made in her visit in Washington a couple of days ago, and about the need for first acting in the field together, and second to exactly procure jointly as Europeans military equipment. And I think that was her answer to the question what European strategic autonomy means. We are quickly running out of time, and let me ask you perhaps a quick question regarding the threat perceptions. Because I think threat perception were mentioned in all of your opening remarks, and of course it's a common wisdom, and it is reality that there are it is different histories, different geographies, etc., that contribute to different threat perceptions among three Weimar Triangle countries. But given that the sort of the threats from the south move to the east, and threats from the east move to the south, the threats become more and more global. What do you think is the potential for well, finding some sort of a compromise on threat perception? Again, this was the part of a strategic compass exercise. Again, we know that this was a classified document, but this is supposed to be the basis for the way forward. So, in few words, what do you think how this compromise on threat perceptions can look, and perhaps if the Weimar Triangle can find this compromise, this can again be an example for whole of the EU.
Well, I don't think that you can find a compromise on threat perceptions. I mean, perceptions are being shaped over time, and they're like developing over time, and they're strongly related to like how the media is like reporting about certain things. So I think it's hard to find a compromise on threat perceptions. I think what you can do obviously is that you have a debate about why, like to create a wider understanding among the three, among the populations, but also among the political elites, why the perceptions are how they are, and maybe why they're so persistent and why they're so deeply like anchored in some countries. I think that's what you can do. Now, finding a compromise is difficult, but creating or deepening mutual understanding about these threat perceptions, I think that's what needs to be improved. And I think there's a lot that can be done in that direction among political elites and among the wider population, I think.
I totally agree. I think, same as Tobias, it is not possible to somehow develop a joint threat perception. And of course, you're right, Julian, that the EU with the strategic compass exercise, with the beginning of the compass exercise, has put the very first joint document on threat perceptions coming from the European External Action Service in the cooperation with the services of the member states. But again, it has been told, I think it is common knowledge by now, that the document has been very broad, and it was basically a collection of threat perceptions coming from different countries. And the big question that we are having now, or the EU is having now, is how to find priorities and how to find focus areas for the EU for the next decade. So on one hand, as Tobias said, helping to or developing a better understanding for various threat perceptions, because we have divergent threat perceptions in Europe, and we will still have it, right? It's one thing. And the other thing is to somehow try to engage in a debate what we want to do with the threat perception and how we want to deal with the threat perceptions, and what the threat perception, the different threat perceptions mean for the EU foreign and security policy for the next decade. So again, focus areas and priorities will have to be set in the strategic compass exercise in order to be effective.
I would be maybe more diplomatic and more optimistic, because I think there can be a common ground for a definition of the threats for European security, for the security of the EU, but also for the European security in the framework of NATO. You know that the strategic compass will be adopted in a time where the new NATO strategic concept will be also adopted. So there will be a kind of complementarity between these two exercises. The last time we really defined our threats, it was the security strategy of Solana in 2003. And at that time, we were in a more peaceful world. There was no the crisis with there was no the Arab Spring. There was not there were no the crisis with Russia. There was the idea of a peaceful rise of China. So now we are in a different world. The threats are not anymore only proliferation or terrorism or international criminality. It's more about the threat of Russia, threat of China. There are many wars and conflicts around the EU. So I think there is a possibility of defining together the threats to European security. Of course, national policies will have to be complementary to the European policy, to the NATO policy. But I think there is a room for a kind of combination of these threats definitions and of the policy of the EU, of NATO, of the different member states. And I would be very clear. France thinks that it's important to talk to Russia, to try to improve the confidence with Russia, to improve the stability with Russia. But France is also very clear when it comes to have a firm stance against some attitudes of the Russian policy. That's why, for example, France has decided to deploy some troops in the Baltic states. That's why France has supported the sanctions towards Russia. So I don't see so much the differences. Of course, the perceptions, the public debates are different, but in a way we are on the same policy, and we need to reinforce the contribution of the Europeans, of the European Union, to the security of Europe, also in the framework of NATO. And this strategic compass will be an opportunity to make a step forward in this direction.
Thank you, Maxime. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. We already passed 6:30. I would love to continue this fascinating conversation, but we have to stop now. Thank you so much for all your contribution and participation. Thank you so much for your insights, Maxime, to this, and Monica. I think we covered a lot in our conversation today, and I think one of the common threads that appeared in our discussion was this issue of trust among the three members of Triangle. I think this is one of the most important factors moving forward. But I'm glad to hear that all of you were to greater or lesser extent hopeful about the future of Triangle, about possible areas of cooperation and strengthening this initiative. So thank you so much again for your time, for your excellent contributions and insights. Thank you for the audience, for your questions and participation. Many thanks to Max Stranger and the entire CASIS team for their help in organizing this event, and also to the Charlemagne Prize Academy for their financial support. Have a great evening, everyone, and hope to see you soon again.